The men who believed the lie September 1940 came with a cold that felt older than the war itself. The North Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction, a slab of grey steel under a sky that offered no comfort. Wind-clawed at the deck of the British transport ship as it pushed westward, its engines humming with the steady determination of a nation that expected to endure. For the men standing aboard, entrance was not a choice. It was all that remained. Oberleutnant Karl Reinhardt stood near the rail, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his thin naval coat. The fabric was not meant for this climate. It had been tailored for parade grounds and lectures, not open ocean and defeat. He pulled it tighter anyway, more from habit than hope. 3 weeks earlier, he had been an officer of the Kriegsmarine, a U-boat navigator, a man with purpose, rank, and certainty. Now, he was prisoner number for 117, heading toward a country he had only heard described as a frozen British afterthought. Canada. Karl watched England dissolve into fog behind them. He felt no sadness at leaving it. He had never expected to see it so closely in the first place. His submarine, U-193, had serviced off the coast of Newfoundland with a damaged ballast system and a slow, unforgiving leak. The radio had gone silent hours earlier. By the time the British destroyer appeared on the horizon, the crew already knew how the story would end. No heroic final dive. No last torpedo fired in defiance. Just cold water rising inch by inch inside a steel coffin. When the hatch opened and British sailors flooded the deck, weapons raised, Karl had waited for rage, for violence, for hatred. Instead, he was met with clipped orders and efficient restraint. No kicks, no blows, a rough hand on his shoulder. Firm but controlled. "You're done," a British officer had said in German that was accented but clear. Let's keep it that way. That moment stayed with Karl longer than he wanted to admit. Now, standing on the transport ship's deck, he touched the iron cross pinned to his uniform. He had earned it during convoy operations in the Bay of Biscay. The medal was meant to symbolize courage, sacrifice, honor. He wondered briefly if it still meant any of those things. Karl had not always been a naval officer. Before the war, he had been a history teacher in Munich, a man of books, lectures, and chalk dust. He had believed deeply in the idea of Germany not just as a nation, but as a civilizational force. Order against chaos, culture against decay, discipline against what he had been taught to see as weakness. He had taught boys about Rome and Sparta, about destiny and decline. And when the new Germany rose, promising renewal, pride, and strength, Karl had embraced it without hesitation. He believed, below deck, in the dim, all-centered hold. Friedrich Fritz Keller sat on the floor with his knees pulled to his chest, at 22. Fritz was younger than most of the prisoners. He had been a machinist in the Ruhr Valley before the war, a factory boy who knew steel and grease better than ideology. He had joined the army because there was work there, and because not joining had consequences no one spoke about openly. Captured in North Africa during a chaotic retreat, he had been shipped across the Mediterranean, through Britain, and now across the Atlantic in the same dazed blur. The war, for Fritz, had never been about glory. It had been about staying alive. He stared at his hands. They were calloused, cracked, stained with old grease that never quite washed away. His mother's last letter had mentioned ration cards again. Bread reduced. Meat almost gone. She had tried to sound calm. "Don't worry about us," she had written. "You have enough to think about." He knew better. A guard's voice echoed through the hold. Followed by the clatter of metal containers, food, the word traveled faster than sound. The prisoners lined up without being told, instinctively forming a loose, quiet queue. There was no shouting, no scrambling. Hunger had taught them efficiency. When Fritz reached the front, a British sailor ladled the stew into his bowl. Steam rose immediately. Rich with the smell of beef and potatoes, 2 slices of bread followed, real bread. And then, almost unreal, a small square of butter placed directly on top. Fritz froze. Butter, not margarine, not some grey substitute. Butter. He carried the bowl to a bench and sat down slowly, afraid the food might disappear if he moved too quickly. Round him, men ate in silence. Some stared at their bowls before touching them. Others ate immediately, heads down, spoons moving fast as if the meal might be taken away mid-bite. Fritz ate slowly. With each mouthful, something twisted inside him. Their single meal, this one, ordinary and remarkable meal, contained more calories than his mother had eaten in days. Above them, unaware of Fritz's thoughts, Karl Reinhardt continued to watch the sea. He told himself the food meant nothing. The enemy was clever. Appear generous now, brutal later. That was what the instructors had warned. If captured, they had said, expect cruelty. Expect humiliation, expect starvation. Karl repeated it silently like a mantra still. Doubt crept in, not loudly, not all at once, just enough to be noticed. In another section of the hold, Matthias Vogel knelt with his head bowed, fingers moving over a warm rosary, at 29. Matthias had the broad hands of a farmer and the quiet intensity of a man who spent long hours alone with his thoughts. He had been a ground crew mechanic with the Luftwaffe in northern France. When Allied bombs turned his airfield into smoking craters, there had been no chance to fight, no chance to flee. Just surrender. Matthias had never trusted politics. He trusted soil, seasons, and God. He loved Germany not as an empire, but as home. A place of fields and family and bells ringing on Sunday mornings. Now, as the ship rolled beneath him, he prayed not for victory, but for endurance. He had no idea what Canada was, beyond fragments, snow, forests, distance, a place where men were sent and forgotten. The ship carried nearly 500 German prisoners, gathered from different fronts and backgrounds, sailors, soldiers, mechanics, clerks, catholics, Protestants, believers, skeptics, men who would never have met in civilian life. They shared one thing. They had been told the same story, that the enemy was weak, degenerate, decaying, that Germany stood alone as the final defender of civilization. That belief was beginning to crack. The voyage stretched on. Days blurred together in the rhythm of engines and meals and guarded deck. Time, the convoy zigzagged across the Atlantic, always alert for U-boats, the same weapons that had once carried these men to war. The irony was not lost on anyone. Karl spent most of his time below deck now. The air was stale, heavy with sweat and oil. At night, he lay awake listening to the ship's metal groan and flex round him. He thought of his wife, Elise, and their daughter, Anna, back in Munich. Elise's last letter had been short. Air raids again. We sleep in the cellar. Anna asks when you're coming home. Karl had no answer for that. What troubled him most was not captivity itself. It was the consistency of the treatment. The guards were firm. Rules were clear. Discipline enforced. But there was no cruelty. Meals arrived on time. Sick men were seen by a medic. On deck, the guards spoke to prisoners as men, not as animals. Once, Karl saw a British sailor quietly replace a prisoner's torn glove during cold deck duty. Pretending not to notice the act himself, None of this fit the picture Karl had been taught. Fritz, assigned to help in the galley due to his factory background, saw even more. The British cook, a red-faced man with a thick accent, treated him like an employee rather than a captive. Instructions were given through gestures and broken German. When Fritz did well, the cook nodded in approval. On the third day, during a short break, the cook offered Fritz a cigarette. Fritz hesitated. The cook simply shrugged and lit his own. For a moment, they stood side by side in silence, smoke curling upward. No hatred, no triumph, just two men doing a job. That night, Fritz lay awake longer than usual. Matthias noticed other things. The guards rotated shifts precisely. Equipment was well maintained. Rifles clean, boots polished. These were not signs of a nation on the verge of collapse. He remembered sermons back home, where priests spoke of moral decay beyond Germany's borders. He wondered quietly where that decay was hiding. On the sixth day, a storm hit. The ship pitched violently, waves slamming against its hull. Several prisoners became violently seasick. Buckets were brought. Extra water distributed. A young German soldier collapsed, pale and shaking. A British medic arrived quickly, knelt beside him, checked his pulse, and administered medication. Matthias watched the scene unfold. Why would an enemy spend resources to preserve an enemy's life? The question would not leave him on the seventh morning. The Atlantic softened. The horizon changed. Land appeared not as ice or barren rock, but as dark green shapes slowly sharpening into forests and hills. The St. Lawrence River opened before them, wide and calm, guiding the convoy inward like a road into another world. Men crowded the rails. Karl felt his breath catch. Villages appeared along the shoreline. Church steeples, farms, roads, automobiles. He counted without meaning 2, 1, 2, 5, 10. More than he had seen in a single view back home in months. As they approached port, cranes rose above the docks, moving cargo with mechanical precision. Warehouses stood clean and tall. Workers moved efficiently and hurried. Well-dressed, electric lights lined the harbor. It was daylight. They disembarked under Canadian supervision. Names were recorded, ranks noted. No insults, no beatings, just process. They were led not into cattle cars, but into passenger train cars, cushioned seats, windows. Fritz ran his fingers along the fabric of the seat, half expecting it to be a trick. Matthias whispered a prayer not of fear, but confusion. Karl stared out the window as the train began to move west. The countryside unfolded endlessly. Paved roads, telephone poles stretching into the distance, farms with barns larger than entire villages he remembered from Bavaria, towns every few miles, shop windows full, no Russian lines, no ruin. Germany had been at war for a year. So had Canada. The math did not add up. Karl felt something shift inside him, something deep and uncomfortable. For the first time since the war began, he allowed a thought he had never permitted before. What if we were wrong? The train rolled on, and with every mile, the lie grew harder to hold. A country that didn't make sense. The train did not slow for ruins. That was the first thing Karl noticed. It cut through the Canadian countryside with steady confidence. Wheels humming over polished rails as if the land itself had agreed to cooperate. Forests rolled past the windows, dense and touched, stretching farther than the eye could follow. Lakes flashed silver in the sunlight. Small towns appeared and vanished again, neat and orderly, their houses standing whole, their roofs intact. No blackout curtains, no bomb scars, no smoke columns clawing at the sky. Karl sat rigidly by the window, hands folded in his lap. posture drilled into him by years of discipline. He told himself to observe, not interpret, facts only. Yet the facts were becoming dangerous. At a crossing, the train slowed briefly. A group of children stood near the road, waving at the passing cars. One of them held an ice cream cone. Ice cream? In the middle of a war. Across the aisle, Fritz noticed it too. He leaned forward, pressing his face closer to the glass like a child himself. His stomach tightened not with hunger this time, but with something harder to name. Back home, his younger sister had once cried when their local shop stopped selling sweets entirely, for after the war, the shopkeeper had said, "Here, children waved ice cream like flags." "Are we sure this is the enemy?" Fritz muttered under his breath. No one answered him. No one. Needed to. Further down the car, Matthias sat quietly, hands folded, eyes moving slowly from scene to scene. He did not stare. He absorbed. A farmer's instinct measure the land, read its health. This land was healthy. Fields were wide and green. Tractors moving in deliberate lines, grain silos stood tall and full. Cows grazed without guts, without fear. Every detail contradicted the image drilled into him. A collapsing, morally rotten West barely holding itself together. If this was decay, it was the most prosperous decay he had ever seen. A Canadian guard walked the aisle, boots clicking softly against the floor. He stopped near Carl, glanced out the window, then back at the prisoners. "Long trip yet?" he said casually. "Camp's a few hours inland." Carl hesitated before replying. Speaking felt like crossing a line. "Yes," he said finally. "It seems far." The guard smiled faintly. "Canada usually is." Then he moved on. The guard's rifle hung loosely at his side, not clenched, not threatening. His tone had not carried mockery or pride, just matter-of-fact ease. Carl Felber. Edges of his certainty dull, a little more. The camp did not look like a camp. That realization hit them all at once, as the train slowed and finally stopped. The men prepared themselves for what they expected: barbed wire. Watchtowers bristling with guns, shouting orders. Chaos. There was barbed wire. There were watchtowers, but they stood back, orderly. Almost restrained. The buildings beyond them were wooden, solid, evenly spaced. Smoke rose from chimneys. Pots were cleared. Lights were already on, even though dusk had not fully settled. A sign stood near the entrance, painted clean and simple: internment camp. POW section, no slogans, no threats, just information. As they disembarked, Canadian officers directed them calmly. Names were checked again. Medical conditions noted. Personal belongings logged and stored. When Fritz handed over his worn photograph, his mother and sister standing stiffly in front of their apartment building, the clerk examined it carefully, then returned it. "You will get this back after inspection," he said. "Don't lose the claim slip." Fritz blinked. "You." "Give it back." The clerk looked genuinely puzzled. "Of course." That night, they were assigned barracks, real barracks. Bunk beds with mattresses thick enough to sink into. Wool blankets folded neatly at the foot. A pot-belly stove sat in the center of each building, already warm. Carl ran his hand over the blanket. It was coarse but clean. He sat on the edge of the bunk, feeling its firmness, its reality. "This is temporary," he told himself. Appearances. But appearances kept adding up. Dinner was served in a mess hall that smelled of bread and meat. Portions were measured but generous. No one rushed them. No one shouted. Matthias bowed his head briefly before eating. Round him, a few men noticed and followed suit, not out of obedience, but instinct, afterward. They were allowed outside for fresh air. The sky above the camp was enormous. Stars spread across it in numbers Karl had not seen since childhood, before the war dimmed Europe's nights. The air smelled of pine and cold earth. Somewhere beyond the fence, an owl called. Fritz leaned against the barracks wall, exhaling slowly. "If this is prison," he said quietly. "It's the strangest one I've ever heard of." Matthias nodded. "It feels more like exile." Karl said nothing. He was watching the guards. They laughed among themselves. One passed a thermos to another. Their movements were relaxed but alert professionals, not brutes. No one looked at the prisoners with hatred. That absence disturbed him more than cruelty would. The first week established a rhythm. Morning roll call, breakfast, assigned work kitchen duty, maintenance, cleaning, wood chopping. Nothing dangerous, nothing demeaning. Karl was assigned to the camp library. He almost laughed when he saw it. Shelves of books lined the walls, English and German, history, literature, engineering manuals, even philosophy. A small desk stood near the window, sunlight falling across its surface. A Canadian officer explained the rules. No political propaganda. He said, no destruction of materials. Other than that read. Karl picked up a book almost without thinking. It was a German translation of Goethe, printed recently. He felt something tighten in his chest. Who printed this, and why? Later that day, Fritz worked in the kitchen again. The cook recognized him immediately. "Hey, raw boy," the man said, grinning. "You peel fast." "That's a skill." Fritz smiled despite himself. They worked side by side, exchanging gestures and broken words. Fritz learned the names of spices he had never used, pepper in quantities that would have been unthinkable back home, during a break. The cook pointed to a newspaper on the table. Fritz glanced at the headline. It mentioned Allied shipping losses. Not victories, not exaggerated triumphs. Just numbers, truth, printed plainly. Matthias spent his days outdoors, repairing fences and clearing snow from pots as winter crept closer. He worked with a small group of Germans and Canadian guards. One of the guards spoke some German. His accent was rough, but sincere. "You farm?" the guard asked. "Yes," Matthias replied. "Back home?" The guard nodded. "Same, Saskatchewan." They shared a look to men who understood seasons, not slogans. That night, Matthias wrote in his small notebook, "If this is the enemy, then we were taught to hate shadows." Karl's breaking point came quietly. In the library, he found a newspaper from Berlin months old, smuggled in through neutral channels. He read it carefully. Victories emphasized, losses minimized. Language heavy with destiny and inevitability. Then he compared it to a Canadian paper from her. Same week, same events, different truths. The difference was not subtle. Karl closed his eyes. He remembered his classroom, his students' eager faces, the certainty with which he had spoken. He had not lied intentionally, but he had not questioned either. That night, lying on his bunk, Karl stared at the ceiling as the stove crackled softly. For the first time, he did not imagine escape. He imagined return. And the fear that gripped him was not of punishment, but of what he would say if he ever went home. Beyond the fence, the Canadian forest stood silent and vast. The camp slept. And inside many of the men, something irreversible had begun. The weight of quiet winter did not arrive all at once. It crept in the way doubt did, soft at first, almost polite. Frost edged the windows in the mornings. Breath lingered in the air longer than it should have. Then one night, without announcement, snow fell and did not leave. By December, The camp was wrapped in white. The prisoners adapted quickly. Wool coats were issued. Boots with proper lining replaced worn leather. Work assignments shifted with the season. Wood became essential. Pots had to be cleared before sunrise. The world shrank to the rhythm of cold and effort. Karl discovered that silence could be heavier than noise. In Germany, even during the war, there had always been sound marching, speeches, radios crackling with confident voices. Here, there were long stretches of quiet broken only by wind through trees and the crunch of snow under. Boots. It left room to think. He hated that. The library remained his refuge and his trap. He read everything now history written by people who did not share his assumptions, philosophy that questioned power instead of worshipping it, newspapers that admitted uncertainty. One afternoon, he found himself reading a Canadian and civics textbook. It explained government not as destiny, but as structure, power divided, argued over, restrained, leaders criticized openly in print. Karl closed the book slowly. At home, criticizing leadership had become dangerous long before the war began. He wondered when he had stopped noticing. Fritz learned how a life could feel almost normal inside a fence. That realization bothered him more than hunger ever had. The kitchen had become his domain. He woke early, worked hard, and nods of approval. The routine grounded him. For a few hours each day, he forgot he was a prisoner. But sometimes, in the evenings, normality felt like betrayal. He would sit on his bunk, holding his tin cup, and think of his mother standing in ration lines, of his sister wearing shoes that were 2 years too small. Here, food was steady, predictable, fair. The guilt settled deep. One night, he confronted the cook. The words spilling out in broken English and frustrated German. My family. No food here. Too much. The cook listened without interrupting. Then he leaned back against the counter. War's a mess. He said simply. Doesn't mean we fix it by making more people starve. Fritz had no answer for that. He washed dishes in silence afterward, the sound of water loud in his ears. What loyalty coursed spring arrived unevenly. Snow retreated in patches, clinging stubbornly to the shadows while mud claimed the open ground. The camp smelled different wet earth, though in pine. Smoke that no longer fought the cold. With the change in season came a subtle shift in the men. Themselves, they talked more, not loudly, not in groups, but in careful pairs, in glances held a second too long, in conversations that stopped the moment someone else approached. Karl noticed it first in the library. Books began to circulate hand-to-hand titles unspoken. Pages folded at certain passages. Men lingered longer at the shelves, as if looking for one thing while thinking about another. A quiet network formed. Not organized enough to be called resistance, not brave enough to be called rebellion. It was something worse. Reflection. Karl hated how natural it felt. One afternoon, he caught himself laughing at a remark made by a Canadian guard about politicians promising more than they could deliver. The laughter came out before he could stop it. The guard raised an eyebrow. Didn't think that joke would translate. Karl forced a smile, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt. Later that evening, guilt hit him hard and without warning. Laughter had once been rationed like everything else back home only for approved occasions. Only at approved targets. Here, it had slipped out freely. That frightened him. Fritz learned that not everyone wanted to see. Clearly, in the kitchen, a group of prisoners had begun to gather near the end of shifts. They spoke in low tones, careful about who listened. At first, Fritz ignored them. Then, one day, one of them, an older sergeant with a scarred cheek, cornered him near the supply shelves. "You're getting comfortable," the man said. Fritz stiffened. I'm working. You're forgetting who you are. The words landed harder than Fritz expected. I'm a machinist, he said. That's who I am. The sergeant leaned closer. You're German, and this place is meant to soften you. Fritz felt heat rise in his chest. So what? They feed us. They don't beat us. That's not softness, that's decency. The sergeant's eyes hardened. Decency is a weapon too. That night, Fritz lay awake replaying the exchange. He realized something unsettling. Cruelty was easy to recognize. Kindness could be dangerous. Matthias felt the split most deeply during Sunday services. The camp allowed them voluntary. And monitored. His small room was cleared. A table became an altar. A German chaplain, himself a prisoner, led prayers. At first, the services had been comforting. Now they felt strained. The sermons leaned harder on obedience, on endurance, on unity against temptation. Words like duty and steadfastness echoed more than mercy or truth. Matthias listened. Head bowed, heart restless. After one service, he stayed behind. Helping stack chairs. Do you believe obedience is always holy? He asked the chaplain quietly. The chaplain hesitated. In times like these, doubt is dangerous. Matthias nodded slowly. That answer scared him more than any punishment. The camp commandant posted new rules in April. They were minor. Expanded work options, more educational access, a new sports field under construction. But one line drew attention. Unauthorized political meetings are prohibited. The effect was immediate. Silence sharpened. Men became cautious again. Trust retreated. Conversation shortened. Karl recognized the tactic instantly, not oppression. But reminder, freedom had boundaries, and everyone noticed them. That night, in the library, Karl found a note slipped inside a book. We need to talk. After lights out. By the wood pile. No name. No explanation. Karl closed the book and sat still for a long time. Every instinct drilled into him screamed danger, informers, provocation, tests, and yet another voice knew. Quiet urged him forward. He went. 5 men stood near the wood pile. Shadows stretched long by the moonlight. Fritz was there. Matthias too. The others Karl recognized, but did not know well. No one spoke at first. Finally, Fritz broke the silence. We can't pretend anymore. Pretend to what? To hate. To believe. To obey. Matthias spoke next. I don't know what Germany is anymore. Only what it isn't. One of the men shifted nervously. Careful. Karl felt the weight of the moment settle on him. What are we doing here? He asked. Fritz looked at him directly, trying to decide who we are when the war ends. The words felt forbidden, powerful, dangerous. They talked quietly about books, about newspapers, about families, about the gap between what they had been told and what they were seeing. No plans were made, no oath sworn. That was the most subversive part. The consequences came faster than expected. A week later, a prisoner was transferred out of the camp. No explanation, no ceremony, just gone. Rumors spread. Like smoke, someone talked. Someone always did. The group dissolved instantly. Eyes avoided one another. Meals were eaten faster. Trust collapsed under the weight of fear. Karl felt the old instincts rush back: self-preservation, caution, silence. He hated how familiar they felt. Fritz was summoned to the commandant's office. He walked in with steady steps, heart pounding. The commandant looked up from his desk. You do good work, Fritz nodded. You speak English now. Yes, yes, sir. The commandant studied him. Be careful. Comfort can feel like betrayal when men are desperate for a certainty. Fritz swallowed. "I just want to survive." The commandant's voice softened. "So does everyone." Fritz left shaken. "Not threatened, warned." Matthias wrote in his notebook that night, loyalty demanded without truth is not virtue. It is fear dressed as faith. He closed the notebook and hid it beneath his mattress. Karl lay awake, staring into the dark. The camp had not changed. The guards had not changed. The food, the work, the rules all the same. What had changed was the men. Understanding had crossed a line. And once crossed, it could not be uncrossed. Spring continued its slow advance beyond the fence. Inside the camp, something harder took root. The knowledge that choosing honesty might one day cost them everything. What loyalty cost Spring arrived unevenly. Snow retreated in stubborn patches, clinging to shadows while mud claimed the open ground. The camp smelled different now, wet earth, thawing pine, and smoke that no longer had to fight the cold. With the change in season came a shift in the men. Themselves, subtle but undeniable. They talked more, not openly, not loudly. In careful pairs, in half-finished sentences, in conversations that stopped the moment another man came too close. Karl noticed it first in the library. Books moved quietly from hand to hand. Certain pages were folded, then unfolded, then folded again by different readers. Men lingered longer than necessary, pretending to browse while watching who else stood nearby. It wasn't rebellion. It was reflection, and that, Karl realized, was far more dangerous. One afternoon, a Canadian guard made an offhand remark about politicians promising miracles during wartime. Karl laughed before he could stop himself. The sound startled him. The guard raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think that one would land." Karl forced a smile. But the laughter haunted him afterward. Back home, humor had rules. Targets were assigned. Anything else was suspicious. Here, it had slipped out freely. That scared him. Fritz learned quickly that clarity was not welcome everywhere. In the kitchen, a small group of prisoners had begun together near the end of shifts. Their conversation stopped. When others approached, one evening, an older sergeant with a scarred cheek pulled Fritz aside between shelves stacked with canned goods. "You're getting comfortable," the sergeant said. Fritz frowned. "I'm working." "You're forgetting who you are." The words hit harder than Fritz expected. "I'm a machinist," he said. "That's who I was before the war." The sergeant leaned closer. "You're German, and this place is meant to soften you." Fritz felt anger rise. "They feed us. They don't beat us. That's not softness. That's decency." The sergeant's voice dropped. "Decency is a weapon too." That night, Fritz lay awake staring at the ceiling. Cruelty was easy to recognize. Kindness was hard-earned. Somehow more unsettling. Matthias felt the divide most clearly during Sunday services. They were allowed without supervision. A simple room, folding chairs, a table serving as an altar. The German chaplain, himself a prisoner, spoke calmly but firmly. Lately, the sermons had changed. Less mercy, more obedience, more warnings about doubt, temptation, and weakness. Matthias listened with his head bowed, but his thoughts wandered. After one service, while stacking chairs, he asked quietly, "Do you believe obedience is always holy?" The chaplain hesitated. "In times like these, doubt can destroy unity." Matthias nodded. But unease settled deep in his chest. Faith that feared questions felt fragile. In April, new rules appeared on the notice board. Nothing severe. Expanded work programs, more classes, and sports field under construction. But one line drew immediate attention. Unauthorized political meetings are prohibited. No. Explanation followed. None was needed. The atmosphere shifted overnight. Conversation shortened. Trust withdrew. Men watched one another again, measuring words, weighing glances. Carl recognized the tactic immediately. Not punishment, reminder. That night, while shelving books, he found a folded slip of paper tucked into a volume of philosophy. After lights out. By the woodpile. No name. Carl sat with the note in his hand for a long time. Every instinct he had ever been taught warned him away. Traps did not announce themselves this plainly. Still, he went. 5 men stood near the woodpile under the thin light of the moon. Fritz was there. Matthias too. No one spoke at first. Finally, Fritz broke the silence. We can't pretend anymore. Pretend to believe. Pretend to hate. Pretend not to see. Matthias spoke next. I don't know what Germany is now. Only what it isn't. One man shifted nervously. This kind of talk gets people moved. Carl felt the weight of the moment settle on him. Then why are we here? Fritz met his eyes. To decide who we are if we survive this. They spoke quietly about books, about newspapers, about families left behind. About the gap between what they had been told and what they were living. No plans were made. No promises exchanged. That was what made it dangerous. The cost came quickly. A week later, one of the men from another barracks was transferred out of the camp. No reason given. No farewell. Just gone. Rumors spread fast. Someone had spoken. Someone always did. The group dissolved instantly. Eyes avoided one another. Meals were eaten in silence. Old. Instincts returned: self-preservation, caution, restraint. Carl hated how familiar they felt. Fritz was summoned to the commandant's office. You do good work, the commandant said, and you're learning the language. Yes, sir. The commandant studied him carefully. Comfort can feel like betrayal to men who rely on certainty. Be careful. I just want to survive. Fritz replied. So does everyone, the commandant said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. That night, Matthias wrote in his notebook, loyalty demanded without truth is not virtue. It is fear-wearing faith. He hid the notebook beneath his mattress and lay awake listening to the wind move through the trees beyond the fence. Carl stared into the darkness of the barracks. Understanding something he had avoided for months. The camp hadn't changed. The guards hadn't changed. The danger was no longer outside the wire. It was inside the men and inside themselves. And once loyalty began to fracture, it did not break cleanly. It cut. When the war found them, the first news came on a warm morning in June. It arrived folded into a newspaper left casually on a table in the mess hall, as if it were nothing special. Men passed it hand to hand, scanning headlines without speaking, eyes pausing a fraction too long on certain words. German forces invade the Soviet Union. Carl read the headline twice. Then a third time. The room felt suddenly smaller. Operation names followed bold. Confident, decisive. The language was familiar. Victorious, assured. Germany on the move again, striking east with unstoppable force. Round him, reactions split along invisible lines. Some men straightened. Pride flickering back to life like a pilot flame. Others went quiet. Their faces hard to read. Fritz felt his stomach drop. Another front. More men. More graves. That's it. Someone whispered, "Now we'll win." Carl said nothing. He read the article carefully. The Canadian paper reported German advances and German casualties. It mentioned supply concerns. Weather, distances, No talk of destiny, just cost. That afternoon, the gods were more alert. Not harsher, just watchful. Roll call was precise. Work assignments double-checked. The commandant addressed the camp briefly, his voice steady. "You'll hear many things," he said. "Not all of them will be accurate. Keep your routines. Follow the rules." It wasn't a warning. It was an acknowledgement that emotions were rising. Fritz struggled with the news more than he expected. That night, he dreamed of factory machines grinding endlessly, gears chewing up men instead of metal. He woke sweating, the image refusing to fade. At breakfast, a young prisoner slapped the table. "They'll crush the Bolsheviks in months. You'll see," Fritz looked at his bowl. "And then what?" The man scoffed. "Then the war ends." Fritz thought of the size of the map he'd seen in the library, of distances that swallowed armies. He didn't argue. Some truths weren't welcome yet. Matthias spent the day in the chapel room. Though no service was scheduled, he knelt alone, hands clasped, wrestling with anger he didn't want to admit. He had believed the war was defensive, protective. This was something else. That evening, he asked the German chaplain a question that had been growing heavier by the day. Does faith survive when it's used to justify expansion? The chaplain didn't answer right away. When nations speak of God, he said finally, it is often God who is misused. Matthias left without replying. Karl noticed a change in the guards too, not in behavior but in distance. Conversations grew shorter, jokes rarer. The war had moved closer to them as well. Brothers, cousins, sons now marching somewhere far away. In the library, Karl found a map pinned to the wall. Europe, the Atlantic. The Eastern Front newly marked. He traced the lines with his eyes. How many men would vanish alone? Those arrows. How many Karls? How many Fritzes? Tension peaked 3 days later. During evening free time, shouting erupted near the far barracks. Men gathered quickly, a tight circle forming. Guards moved in immediately, firm and controlled. 2 prisoners were pulled apart, one bloodied, the other shaking with rage. It's treason to doubt now. The injured man shouted, the other spat back. It's treason to lie. The guards separated them without violence. The camp fell silent afterward. No one slept easily that night. The consequences were swift and visible. Group privileges were reduced. Evening gatherings shortened. The library closed an hour earlier. No accusations were made. No names announced. Collective punishment. Karl understood the logic. Even as he resented it, division invited instability. Stability required limits. Fritz stopped talking during meals. He focused on work, on routine, on survival. But the news kept replaying in his head. The war was no longer something happening far away. It was moving toward an edge where no one could pretend it would end cleanly. One evening, he sat beside Karl outside the barracks. "Do you think it ever stops?" Fritz asked quietly. Karl considered the question. "No," he said at last. "It just changes shape." A week later, letters arrived. Not for everyone. Matthias received one. His hands shook as he opened it. His village had lost 3 men already. 1 missing. 1 presumed dead. His younger cousin drafted. At the bottom, his mother had written, "We pray you are safe." Matthias folded the letter carefully. He was safe, and he had never felt more ashamed of that fact. That night, as the camp settled into an easy sleep, Karl wrote a single sentence in the margin of a book he was cataloguing. Wars do not end when they are won. They end when the lies collapse. He closed the book and turned out the light. Beyond the fence, The world was burning wider. And inside the camp, the men could feel it now. The war had found them,